Hello and welcome to another weekly update. I'm still out and about. I'm still in North Carolina, so apologies for the video and the audio quality probably. But we're here having a great time. You got one side of my face or the other. I think that's just the way it's going to be, unless I sit weirdly like this, which I could do. We had having a great time. Really good. Went down to Ocean Isle Beach, if you know where that is, for a few days, and now we're back. And the weather has been amazing, but apparently it's all going to break tomorrow. But never mind. Anyway, what are we talking about this week? A couple of interesting things. I'm not going to spend ages talking about them because, vacation. But there are some interesting things to go through because stuff obviously still happens. First one of those is a blog post from the Microsoft 365 platform blog. That's the one at devblogs.microsoft.com. And it's all about how you can boost your app's visibility and engagement in Microsoft 365. So this is some new functionality that is coming to apps that are built. And what's interesting is that a lot of this stuff is familiar to Teams developers because there are things to surface applications in Microsoft Teams that have been around for a while. So the idea of using actions to take action on things that are happening in Microsoft Teams, that same thing is now coming to the Microsoft 365 application. The reason for bringing this up is not because I think there's lots of people using the Microsoft 365 app. I mean, there are, people use it, I think, on the web version of it. I think they use quite a lot. I do see people using the Microsoft 365 app as well. But for me, what's more interesting in a way about a lot of this stuff is that it kind of shows the evolution of Teams apps as broadening out to being about a lot more than just Teams now. And about being, really the foundational pieces of building apps in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And this is kind of just one action. The actions are just one example of doing that. So I think that's kind of really interesting. The blog post goes into detail about how you can build an action. It's currently in private preview, but you can apply to join that early private preview. This is quite unusual that they announce a private preview and are asking for people to join it. Usually you don't find out that there's a private preview until it goes public, and then you find out there's a whole bunch of companies that have been working on it in private. But this time around, they're inviting people to be part of that preview. So if that sounds interesting, and if you think you have a good candidate, you think you could use actions really well in whatever it is you're doing outside of Microsoft Teams, then look at that. The blog post also goes into some detail about the GA of launch pages in the Microsoft 365 iOS and Android app as well, if that's interesting to you. So go check out the blog post. There's a couple of admin controls and stuff as well for doing that around sort of managing apps and stuff in the admin center. So that's quite a lot in that blog post really. So definitely worth a read if any of those things kind of land with you or you kind of think they're interesting to go through. Next up, Waldeck has done a great blog post actually about Microsoft Graph Connectors, which Microsoft Graph Connectors have grown in popularity quite a lot recently, since they have become the way to ingest information into Microsoft. They've always been the way to ingest Microsoft data into Microsoft 365. The interesting part now is that data can now be used by Copilot, and suddenly that makes connectors way more interesting to way more people. So they have a real focus right now. Both messaging extensions and graph connectors are enjoying their time because they're both ways of interacting with Copilot. But anyway, Waldeck has got this good blog post about the anatomy of a graph connector. So this is really, really useful if your organization, your company, your boss has just said to you, hey, we need to get on this graph connector thing. We've got a big silo of data. Make a graph connector to take it and ingest it into Microsoft 365. This is the perfect blog post for you because it shows you where connectors fit in the general scheme of things, shows you some of the terminology of the language that gets used so you can work your way through the documentation, shows you the architecture, shows you what you need to do, and then ends with some samples and some walkthroughs and stuff like that. So great blog post to have if you're just starting out on that connector journey, because it kind of nicely pulls together everything that you might need into one place. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is a blog post by Mary Jo Foley who blogs over at directionsonmicrosoft.com. And this is kind of an interesting one about Microsoft 365 Copilot. And kind of talking about it, the fact that it's going to be generally available on November the 1st. Mary Jo has some information about some, additional caveats and things that are still going to be in preview, which are kind of interesting. The reason for this blog post, I think, is really following the earnings call that happened last week, and I think it's interesting to go through because Mary Jo has obviously got access. She's got some good information that she's managed to collect and gather. So it's worth going through what those things are. One of the interesting things she calls out is that SharePoint Copilot is going to be in preview in November and not GA until March. And Excel is going to be in preview in November and not GA until February. There's a couple of other things as well. So I think it's kind of interesting. The bigger thing as well, if you're wondering why Copilot, particularly for Microsoft, I mean, there's a million reasons. But also one big one is Azure growth. So all of this Copilot stuff, and in fact, it doesn't really matter whether it's Copilot or not Copilot. Any of this AI stuff, Azure OpenAI, all of it drives Azure units and Azure consumption. And Azure revenues were up 29% for Q1. So that's kind of like the other kind of big thing is that, it almost doesn't matter, whether you use Copilot, whether you do your own thing, whether you bring your own models, however you do it, you're going to be doing it on Azure, and therefore Azure always wins. So that's the kind of interesting kind of key theme I think that's coming out. Expect to see more Azure growth. Expect to see Azure doing better and better. As kind of time goes on, because anything AI that's happening, on the Azure stack massively drives Azure growth. Okay, I think that's everything I want to talk about this week. We've got, I'm back next week, and then we're not that far away from ESPC, which is a conference that's happening in Amsterdam. We're also not that far away from the Call and Contact Center Expo in London. Both of those are happening towards the end of November. We were going to have the European Collaboration Summit about that same time or early December. That's now been pushed out till I think March timeframe. But keep an eye on kind of all those blog posts and all the websites for things that are happening, or you can keep track of what I'm doing at my speaking workshops page at thoughtstuff.co.uk. Whatever it is you're doing this week, I hope you have a good one. I hope you have as much fun as I'm having, and I will speak to you again next time.